More than 7 months later, the whole world continues to follow this brutal war in Ukraine. On one hand, everyone is asking the similar or even the same question: what measure should the international community take together to stop the war in Ukraine? And most importantly, how can we stop the behavior, especially this military expansion under Vladimir Putin? But on the other hand, people are saying, how about this victory for the country of Ukraine? Given the fact the war drags so long, and not only it's more devastating to see this economic impact towards the whole world, but meanwhile, what is the future for the country of Ukraine? At this moment, there are so many questions that we need to ask. And last but not least, and what about the word democracy? How should we understand the word democracy today? And given the fact that the protests and riots are taking place in both countries at the same time. So that's why, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite Mr. Doug Klain. Doug is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, where he focuses on Russia's war on Ukraine, authoritarianism in Russia, and Ukraine's democracy building process. Klain has worked with the Atlantic Council since 2019 and most recently as Assistant Director of the Eurasia Center. Doug, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Hi, Will. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely, the pleasure is all mine. Again, Doug, as we mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because one of the amazing articles that you wrote, which is entitled "Mobilization Can Save Russia's War." Now, I want to get started with the first question. Again, as we mentioned before, more than 7 months, the whole world continued to follow this brutal war, and we don't know how far or how much that Vladimir Putin is going to cave or is going to give up. But what is concerning at the moment is the Russians' military power, and given the current speech that came from Vladimir Putin, he's willing to mobilize civilians or even never trained average Russians to join the battle in order to satisfy his own needs. So can you help us to understand how concerning is the Russians' military power at the moment? And the second, what is the ultimate purpose that Vladimir Putin is trying to accomplish throughout the war?
Sure. So I think that the best starting point is looking at what's happening on the ground in the war right now. Currently, Ukraine plainly is winning this war. Ukraine is pushing Russia's forces back, and after months of relative stalemate with the front lines not moving all that much, Ukraine is now breaking through Russia's front lines on multiple fronts, liberating territory and delivering decisive loss after decisive loss for the Russian forces. So that's the context in which President Putin has made this announcement that Russia will have its largest mobilization or conscription program since the Second World War. He's targeting for 300,000 Russians to be mobilized and then sent over to fight in Ukraine. Now, this mobilization, it's a move that Putin did not want to make. From the beginning of this invasion back in February, he has said that this is not a war. Russia is engaged in a special military operation, that this is something that, in his mind, he thought would be over in a couple of days. Obviously, that was wrong. But he promised back in March to the Russians that there would not be a wide-scale mobilization. He said that is something that you would do in a war, and we're not at war. He broke that promise. He went back on that because Russia's forces are not doing so well. So this is an attempt to try to salve the wounds, to stop the bleeding. But one of the big points that I make in this piece for Foreign Policy magazine is that this mobilization is not going to do what Putin wants.
Well, Doug, as you mentioned before, Putin can actually stop the war today, or he can even stop the war right at this moment. And again, there are various reasons that for him not to do so. At this moment, we're still very much interested. Why has not Putin stopped the war at all? So in other words, we know that since the beginning of the outbreak of the war, he has become the enemy not only for Ukraine but also almost across the entire world. And more countries are forming unifications, or more countries are standing in line to condemn this behavior. Not only that we've seen this economic devastation because of the war on both countries, and also had influence on America and also many countries in Europe and Southeast Asia, but why has not Putin put the stop on this war? So in other words, what can we do, or what kind of message he's sending to the world? And that's the first question. And the second question is, how about Vladimir Putin's rhetoric these days? Because again, we'll always say politicians say one thing but actually do the other. But given this complication of Putin's background, I think we can't afford to take his words easily. So we have to understand the deeper meaning behind the rhetoric. So the next question is, how should we understand Putin's rhetoric? Is everything he's saying today actually meant something much greater? Or there's something that behind the message that we have not, as a community, figured out yet?
Well, look, we as observers cannot see into Putin's mind. But I think that it is fair and, given the context of this war and the quite good reporting that we've had, I think that we can take Putin at his word. That for years, Westerners especially have tried to see behind what Putin is saying. We've seen worrisome, violent rhetoric that Putin and the Russian state media apparatus have been using for years, especially this language of dehumanizing Ukrainians, of priming the Russian people to see them as less than human, to see them all as Nazis. That is this language that they have used for years and that Putin has used for years. And for quite some time, I think a lot of people didn't want to believe that was really what a world leader thought. Didn't want to believe that was what a supposed superpowered nation believed. And so we've tried to see behind, maybe not taking this at face value. Seeing what Russia has done in Ukraine, I believe, quite clearly genocidal acts that Russian soldiers have committed, propped up by genocidal language from Russian officials. I think that we can take Putin at his word. And I think that that's one of the reasons why 7 months into this disastrous war, it continues to go on. Putin has had these faulty assumptions and these faulty beliefs about Ukraine and about the world and how the international community would respond to this invasion. He believed that Russian troops would be able to roll across Ukraine in a matter of days, that the Ukrainian government was weak, that Zelensky would flee the country. I think that what he expected to happen was something that maybe looked more similar to what happened last year when the Taliban was sweeping across Afghanistan quite rapidly, taking territory and cities quickly, with the Afghan army melting away, with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani fleeing the country. The opposite of that happened in Ukraine. The world was surprised and I think inspired, certainly Ukrainians were, when Zelensky told United States officials who had offered him an evacuation, he said, the fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride. And he did that knowing that he could be facing certain death, that there were Russian hit squads out to kill him and his family. So these were these assumptions that Putin had that were proven quite wrong. And a lot of it has been underpinned by this distorted view of the world and especially of Ukraine, of seeing it as this rightful possession of Russia's, something that, Ukrainian nationhood is not this real thing, that Ukrainians are, rather than their own distinct identity, kind of this little Russian, this little brother to Russia, and, rightful subjects of the Kremlin. That has no basis in reality, and Ukrainians have made sure that the world can see that. So I think that those are some of the reasons why this war continues to go on, that Putin really does have this distorted view of the world, and being a dictator with few people around you willing to say, no, you're wrong, this is the way that things actually are. He continues to be in this echo chamber of his own making, and it makes it perhaps more difficult for him to see reality and to end this war.
Doug, I want to go back to the article, and this is something that you wrote. I thought it's pretty interesting for us to discuss. And you said, I quote, "In stark contrast Ukraine's military has spent the last 8 years reshaping itself from the kind of descriptive Soviet-style force that Russia still has into a modern Western-style military with emphasis on professionalization. Now, we know on one hand, we have heard the rhetoric from Vladimir Putin, and we have seen the defeat of Russian military. But let's talk about this military power from the Ukrainian side. Now, at this moment, undeniably speaking, the Ukrainians are actually winning the war, which is a good sign. And I think this is something that, even as you said before, it's very much surprising to Vladimir Putin. But of course, that's a victorious news for the entire world. But meanwhile, at this moment, how should we understand this capability of the Ukrainian military? So let's just say, again, I don't want to forecast anything, but hypothetically, if the war continues to drag on, how much do you think that Ukrainian military are able to hold combat against the Russian military if the war goes forth? And that's the first question. And the second one is there any other significant players can also support Ukrainian in addition to what U.S. government has done?
Sure. So in looking at the forecast for what's to come in the future, I think that the outlook for Ukraine is far more positive than it is for Russia. First off, the Ukrainian leadership is pretty realistic that this war may not be over soon. They believe that the war will be far bloodier and last for far longer than any of us hopes it will, perhaps for a year or two or even longer. That is a grim but perhaps more realistic view of what could happen. It's in quite a bit of contrast from what Russian officials believed would happen, that this war could be over in a matter of days. So I think that that's a good sign that the Ukrainians are planning for the long term. They're also receiving a steady flow of supplies, the ammunition, the weapons, the logistics, supplies that they need to sustain a war effort in the long term. And they're getting that from their Western partners, from the United States, from NATO, from other Western countries. Russia, meanwhile, their resources, while they weren't so good in the first place, Russian troops were sent in with bad, old, outdated equipment and, rotten rations that had expired years ago. So that was their starting point. And one of the really interesting tactics that Ukraine has employed in this war is deliberately targeting Russia's ammunition depots, their logistics hubs, making it much harder for Russia to sustain its forces in the long term. And so when we look at these two dynamics of one side that has planned for the long term and is getting the supplies to keep on going, and one side where the world keeps getting a bit smaller, where they're losing their supplies, it's getting tougher to sustain themselves, that's a recipe for more successes for Ukraine, I believe. You mentioned a point that I had touched on in the article, that there really is this stark difference between the Russian military and the Ukrainian military. And it's a difference that came about after Russia started this war in 2014 by invading Crimea and the Donbass. So both the Ukrainian and the Russian militaries have derived from the Soviet Union's military. And so much of the leadership served in the Soviet military. The Soviet military was really this decrepit, slow-moving, poorly run institution. And there were a lot of key differences from Western militaries that have a higher emphasis on professionalization. One of the things is that, Soviet and now Russian officers in the field, they don't have this trust from their leadership. They don't have the ability to really make split-second decisions in the field. If they're, in the field leading their troops, they have to, radio back to command and really, get this hand-holding almost to figure out what to do. Meanwhile, Ukraine and other Western militaries have this real emphasis on trusting their officers in the field, training them well, and giving them the tools they need to make these decisions in the field and to exercise their own judgment. It makes them much more nimble, much more able to respond to crises and to enemy attacks. And it's something that has been playing out in the field. Ukrainian forces are more nimble. They're more professional. They were much like Russia's military before 2014. And that's part of the reason why Russia had success then in trying to take territory and starting this war. Ukraine couldn't take Crimea back then. It couldn't take the Donbass back then. And Ukrainians learned that lesson. They have worked, trained, and learned quite a lot from Western militaries. And they've made their fighting forces look far more like perhaps the United States or the United Kingdom, more like a NATO army. And we're seeing that success play out in the field. For them, there was a quote that I had included in the article from, one unit where they've actually been cutting down on some of their forces. When Russia invaded, many Ukrainians ran to the front line to volunteer to fight, which is, again, in stark contrast from the now 700,000 Russians that have fled mobilization. But, this one unit in Ukraine was actually cutting down on the number of people it had. They said, look, we had a bunch of eager guys, but we need to train our people well. We need skilled fighters who we can rely upon. We don't just need eager guys who may not necessarily know what they're doing. So we're going to cut people out. One good professional soldier is worth 10 crazy guys, was this quote that came from the recruiter who was responsible for this. And again, that stands in stark contrast to this Russian approach of literally taking up as many men as you can, giving them barely any training, any tools, and just throwing them onto the front line. And I think that this is something that is going to find quite a bit more success for Ukraine in the long term once again.
Doug, based on the recent report, also people are also very concerned about Putin, very likely, and we hope that it's not going to happen, regarding his strategy on nuclear weapons, because we know that we're looking at someone who doesn't play by the rules. So again, going back to his rhetoric, people are very worried or anxious if Vladimir Putin can play the last strategy, which is to hit the button and the nuclear weapons are going to wipe out the Ukrainians or anyone in a split second, and we hope and I pray that that doesn't happen. Now, help us to understand, what about this nuclear weapon rhetoric, or what about this nuclear weapon capability under Vladimir Putin at this moment, and how much do you think that he's willing to sacrifice his people, the resources, even himself in order to win the war? What do you think?
So I think that there's two important points for us to keep in mind. The first is that we should take this threat seriously. And that's something that U.S. President Joe Biden in a speech yesterday emphasized, that there is a risk and we should take it seriously. We shouldn't just dismiss it and say, Putin's not going to do it. We're going to call his bluff. But at the same time, we need to recognize that throughout this war, Russia has been saber-rattling and using nuclear weapons to try to scare and intimidate the world to keep Ukraine from receiving support, saying if you keep on supporting Ukraine, who knows what will happen. So that is a tool that they have been using for months, and they know that it scares people in the West. They know that it is a tactic to try to scare them off from supporting Ukraine. And they know that it works sometimes if we allow it to. If we, just kind of allow ourselves to be cowed by it. I think it's one response that is, worth highlighting comes from Ukrainians themselves. Officials in Kiev have recognized the very real risk that perhaps their city could be wiped out in a matter of seconds by a nuclear strike. They acknowledge that risk, though, and they've said all that will do is change the costs of this war. It will not change the outcome of an eventual Ukrainian victory, because Ukraine is determined. And, while we can't make any predictions about how anybody would react, the Ukrainians have said that a nuclear strike will not force them to surrender. They will keep on fighting. It will only change the costs, but not the outcome. Something else that is worth us recognizing is, what does Putin gain by using nuclear weapons?
Absolutely.
What much of the reporting has been on is that if he were to use nuclear weapons, perhaps it could be a tactical nuclear weapon, which is something that is, on something of a smaller scale, meant for use in the battlefield. While still quite serious, though, tactical nuclear weapons are somewhat similar to the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the U.S. in World War II. So it is still something to take seriously, but they are on a smaller scale. So if he were to use nuclear weapons, what would it accomplish? Would Ukraine surrender? Probably not. Would the world be scared off from further supporting Ukraine? Probably not. If anything, like many of Putin's other escalations, his escalations have only brought the world together more, shown the world that Putin is not acting rationally, that he needs to be constrained, and it's united the world against Russia and turned Russia into a pariah. The United States has said that if Russia does this, while the U.S. will not immediately respond with a nuclear response, but in a way, all bets would be off. And there's been some reporting to suggest that if Putin were to use a nuclear weapon, that the United States would authorize conventional strikes to take out nuclear capabilities in Russia, or perhaps to give the Ukrainians the tools to do that themselves. It's been a big red line for the Biden administration that Ukraine should not strike on Russian soil. That red line may disappear if Russia starts using nuclear weapons. And perhaps the Biden administration would even give Ukraine the intelligence to say, look, here's where it is, here's the tools, go ahead and take it out. And so I think, if Ukraine chose to do that, the United States does not give orders to Ukraine.
Right.
Ukraine is prosecuting its own war. We're only supplying them with some of the weapons to help defend themselves. So I think that all of these are good things to recognize. The threat may be real, and we should take it seriously, but we need to ask ourselves, what would Putin accomplish with it? Very little. He would only make things worse for himself. And why do they use these nuclear threats? It's to scare the world off from supporting Ukraine. It's a tactic they know tends to work.
Doug, I know you're very busy. Stay with me. I only have 2 more questions. Now, I know lately you also came out another article, which is very interesting, mentioned one of the financial celebrities in the US, which is Elon Musk. And it says, memo to Elon Musk, only Ukrainian victory can stop Vladimir Putin. We know, again, that since the outbreak of the war, that every single person, it doesn't matter the color of the skin or the background or nationalities, and everyone is very much engaging in discussing and hopefully offer some peaceful or feasible solutions between Russia and Ukraine since the war. But somehow this article that you wrote and dive into, that Elon Musk seemed to us that willing to be the mediator or even to be the peacemaker for Russia between Russia and Ukraine at this moment. Now, help us to understand regarding all these people or celebrities or different positions or in the government or in different sectors. What is something that they're missing today when they're trying to bring peace between the two countries? So that's why you were saying Ukrainian victory can only can stop Vladimir Putin. What does that mean?
So what happened with Mr. Musk, he put out a series of tweets suggesting what he thought was a proposed peace deal to bring peace to Ukraine and to end this war. And some of the really problematic and foolhardy, I think, proposals that he had in there were that essentially Ukraine trade away some of its land to Russia, that Russia somehow gets to keep land that it is trying to conquer, that it does not fully control at this point, and that Ukraine very well may retake soon. And that this should be some kind of a land for peace deal just to stop the fighting. Now, I normally don't think that something like this would be worth focusing on, but the idea is that, because it's unlikely that Elon Musk is going to be some grand mediator here. I find that quite unlikely. But the reason why it is worth focusing on is because this argument that Musk brings up, that this land for peace idea, it's something that many in the West have proposed, and that they keep on talking about and saying that why doesn't Ukraine just give away some of its territory? And that is a huge problem for a couple of reasons. First off, the idea that we in the West can somehow impose peace on Ukraine, that we can just make this decision, really denies agency to Ukrainians. Their country has been invaded. They have volunteered to defend their country and liberate their families. They are the ones that are fighting and dying here. And none of us can make some decisions for them. And Ukrainians have made that quite clear. Musk was personally rebuked by President Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials who said, look, Elon, we don't know what you're talking about. This is a terrible idea. And the reason why this land for peace idea is so foolhardy is because, in the first place, no one in Ukraine would agree to it. And if you're proposing some kind of peace deal, you need people to actually take it seriously.
That's right.
Ukrainians will not trade away their territory because they know the horrors that happen under Russian occupation. Everywhere in the world, we have heard the names of these places like Bucha, Irpin, Izium now, Mariupol. We have seen the mass graves. We've seen the rampant sexual assault and violence against women, men, children perpetrated by Russian soldiers, the torture against people living under occupation. So for Ukrainians to trade away some land to Russia would be consigning the people living on that territory to untold horrors. So why would anybody in Ukraine agree to that? Ukraine has also proposed peace to Russia already, and Russia has denied it. Ukraine is not the one that's standing in the way of peace, being too belligerent to keep on fighting. Early in the war, President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government proposed to Putin that they would swear off seeking NATO membership, that Ukraine would be a neutral country. They were willing to make these concessions to Russia, but Putin continued in his invasion, continued waging war to eradicate Ukrainian nationhood, committing more of these crimes on territory that Russian soldiers are sweeping across and occupying. Things that we've learned about now only because we've given Ukraine the tools that it needs to liberate this territory. And when they liberate that, that's when we're finding these horrors. That's when we're finding the survivors who can tell the world about what was done to them. And so I think that with these kinds of land for peace proposals, which are being said by more people than just Elon Musk, and that's why we should, focus on countering these faulty narratives, we need to recognize that Ukrainians would not accept something like that, and that something like that may simply give Russia room to regroup and keep on waging war as it's done before, as it did after 2014. The best way to actually bring peace is by giving Ukraine the weapons it needs to keep liberating its territory. That is the strategy that we've been doing that has been working. As Ukraine liberates its territory, the people that have been liberated on this retaken territory are no longer suffering under Russian occupation. And Ukraine is proving that it can win this war, that it can take back all of the territory that Russia is temporarily occupying, can free all of its people, and can keep Russia out once it's kicked out Russia's invading forces. That's the strategy that's been working. So why would we stop? Why would we stop that? I say that it's far more sensible and far more logical and realistic to give Ukraine the weapons it needs to win this once and for all and actually bring peace about.
And I think that totally makes sense, Doug. Again, I 100% agree with you. Now, let's wrap up our conversation and the last question is, let's talk about the word democracy. Again, in your bio that you're an expert on Ukraine's democracy building process. And I think for every single country that after going through this devastation of the war or any international crisis, that this meaning of democracy has to be elevated or has to be redefined in a much greater way. Now, Doug, help us to understand not only for the country in the West, but also for the country in Ukraine, how should we re-understand or redefine the meaning of democracy, especially, say, post the war in Ukraine? And also, what about for the Ukrainian government? What about even for the people in Ukraine or in Russia, in both countries? What does that mean when we redefine the meaning of the word democracy? What do you think?
So I think that when talking about Ukraine, it's important for us to acknowledge that for years, for decades, Ukraine has been a flawed democracy. It has had rampant corruption. It has had relatively weak government institutions. Rule of law has not always been implemented fairly. And, government officials have been able to get away with massive grifts and with violations of the law. When Ukraine in 2014 and 2013 had its revolution of dignity, the Euromaidan, expelling a pro-Russian president, that was a democratic revolution. Presidents after that who were elected, Petro Poroshenko and now President Zelensky, were elected on pro-democracy platforms. President Zelensky, his big promises when he was elected in 2019, in addition to bringing an end to the war, were that he was going to fight corruption, that he was going to bring about these crucial reforms to Ukraine's government to allow it to have a flourishing Western European-style democracy and economy. Now, this war has put some of that on hold. The most important thing is for Ukraine to win the war and stop the fighting. But even during this war, there have been some promising things. President Zelensky and the Ukrainian parliament have advanced things to protect minority rights and rights for LGBTQ people. They have continued to tackle corruption in some ways. There's been some very high profile things where they've, anti-corruption officials have taken out these massive bribes and taken these, $6 million or $10 million bribes and put them instead to the military to keep fighting the war. Those have been some great stories there. And I think that when we talk about what Ukraine post-war looks like, the success of Ukraine going forward will be on finally succeeding in bringing about these critical reforms to turn Ukraine into a successful European-style democracy, in stamping out corruption, in making sure that there's rule of law, in strengthening these kind of core democratic bedrocks. And something else that we can probably project is that after the war, there's going to be massive international investment in rebuilding Ukraine, in bringing about this real kind of renaissance for the country. The whole world has seen the ingenuity and the determination of Ukraine. And post-war, I think that many people would want to partner with Ukraine further. And so in that context, as the world tries to help Ukraine rebuild, I think that one of the things that will happen is that there will be a lot of conditionality on aid for Ukraine, on making sure that, yes, we will help you rebuild, but make sure that you strengthen your democracy at home, that you take care of these core reforms finally. And I think that given the truly historic popularity and legitimacy that President Zelensky and his government have because of this, their response to this war, I think that they'll have quite a lot of political capital to spend to get this done once and for all, and to give Ukraine the tools it needs to succeed in the future. So that's that. I think that's a fair projection to make on Ukraine and its optimistic democracy building process post-war.
And I think, Doug, you're right, because today, even though, let's say, regarding what's happening in Ukraine, and also, of course, that many countries across the world are also undergoing this democratic system, or they're trying to look for this example of democracy, but we should always know, and we should always remind ourselves that we need to understand how a democratic system is supposed to be honored and also well protected. And of course, in the end, not only it's about the government, but also about the people, how people are going to flourish and become successful politically, economically, and also socially within every single country. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Doug Klain. And Doug, it's a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, where he focuses on Russia's war on Ukraine, authoritarianism in Russia, and Ukraine's democracy building process. Doug, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. And also, I encourage everyone to go online, look for Mr. Klain's article. It's called "Mobilization Can Save Russia's War." And again, it's a great article. It's a wonderful read. And thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. And we love to have you back on the show as we continue to talk about the political and also this economic changes both in Russia and Ukraine. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks very much for having me. Pleasure to chat with you today.